Okay, so in this video, I just want to talk about a few concepts for locking down or securing your WordPress website from attacks, particularly from out of your zone. So here in Australia, when I look at my logs, I'll see tens of thousands of attacks from Russia, China, Netherlands, Germany, UK, all over the world. And what we're going to talk about is how we can stop that from affecting the performance of your server. So really this is about not necessarily all about the WordPress optimization. There's a lot of discussion around caching and optimization and minification and all that sort of stuff using caching plugins and performance plugins. This is more about from the back end outside of WordPress. I'll give you an example here. If I'm looking at in my cPanel for one of my sites, in the visitors, I'm going to just do a quick search for wp-login. And you'll see here there are hundreds of wp-login attempts from IP addresses all over the world. Now, that's not me. So that is either bots or hackers or someone trying to get into my WordPress website. So this file, there's another one which is xmlrpc. I should say that this is obviously for your login to WordPress. And again, lots of xmlrpc. That could be bots, could be whatever. Now, xmlrpc is only used for remote applications. So if you've got a scheduling plugin which schedules social media and blog posts, it might be connected to your WordPress website, and on certain days it'll push out a post. It uses xmlrpc to do that. Also mobile apps where you publish posts to your WordPress website from your mobile uses xmlrpc. But clearly all of these from IP addresses all over the world, they're not legitimate, they're just attacks. Why is this important? Well, every time something accesses a PHP file on your website, the PHP language starts up, and in most cases, like for example, with xmlrpc and wp-login, it fires up PHP, it makes a connection to your MySQL database, it does some checks, and then if the authentication fails, and it bums out. Now, that all takes resources. So if you get a distributed attack coming in on your hosting, and it's from all over the world and it's accessing these files, your server becomes very, very slow processing rubbish, basically processing attacks on your server which have no value to you. So the other thing that happens is it affects your stats, because it also will show up in your visitors stats if you're using any of those analytics. Also, it just can bring your whole website to a halt because of the resources that you have being exhausted. So what we want to do is, if you don't use xmlrpc at all, it can be completely disabled. There's a simple way to do that. I'm not going to talk about it here. Or obviously you do need to use wp-login to log into your site. So what I tend to do is block access to those files, to IP ranges within a region, or to specific people. So if you're working in a team, you can just put in the IP ranges of those people for their internet connections and only give them access to these files. You can open it up to a region, you can open it up to a country. One thing to remember is when you do this, if you get support from a vendor and they need to log into your website, they're probably from overseas, and they're not going to be able to log in unless you add their IP addresses or temporarily disable this blocking. So how do I do that? Well, I'll start from the end and then we'll work backwards to how we achieve it. So I'm going to look at my .htaccess file. So this is on a cPanel server, and this is the file that I create. It looks like a lot of work, but it's actually not. So let's go back to the top here. What I've got up here is a link to a website. And I'm just going to copy that with a new tab. And what I'd say is, for example, if I'm in Europe, I'm actually in Australia, but I'll say Europe, that picks all of these countries here. Let's say we don't want all of Europe, we just want, say, Germany. Where are we? Germany. Pick Germany, and then we create a htaccess allow list. I'll explain that shortly. Hit the create button. And then here's a list of the IP ranges I want to allow anyone in Germany to be able to access xmlrpc and wp-login. I'm actually in Australia, so I'm going to just change that to Australia and create an ACL list. There's my list there. So what I normally do is I start with a, actually I haven't got a sample here, so I'm just going to grab this here. So I start with a notepad document. Actually, I do have a file there. So I normally keep just a blank file for this. That's right. Yes, that's correct at the moment. Okay, so I start with this list here. What I then do is use that website we were just on, create the list. Now, what we want to see, it's got to deny. That's not what we want. We don't want to deny these IP addresses. We want to deny everyone, but only allow the people in that list. So we use a htaccess allow list. I'm not select any countries. Okay. Oh, sorry, that reset when I clicked the country. So we want Australia and we want an htaccess allow list. Here's my allow list. Copy that to the clipboard. Go to my notepad document. And there is my rule that I want. So I want a files match the end, close it, files match at the beginning, and I'll max. This is actually a regular expression. So this caret represents it has to be the beginning. These brackets is basically collecting those rules into a group. And because it is a regular expression, we've got to escape any characters like hyphens and dots. So this is saying wp-login.php or xmlrpc.php and then the end of the file. Okay, so basically it's going to match either of these. It's going to deny from everyone and then only allow from these IP addresses that we created, saying that we're allowing from Australia in this case. Pretty much blocking that. Now, this should be at the beginning of your htaccess so that this will process first. Now, there are plugins that you can get for WordPress that do similar things. My view is you're better off to do it here because this is at the web server level, not at the PHP level. What that means is as soon as the request comes in, it checks this, does the IP address coming in, match anything in this range. If so, let it through. If not, reject it with a 401 error saying that they're not authorized. So it doesn't fire up PHP, doesn't fire up MySQL, doesn't put any load on your server whatsoever because it's rejected before it even gets to PHP. And PHP, MySQL, when they're running, that is what puts the load on your server. So if you've got thousands of requests coming in, your server's going to run out of resource and run really slow. Doing this here, it's only going to accept requests to login.php and xml.php from Australian IP addresses in this case. So there's a better way to lock that down. Now, one thing I didn't note in here is there's also the WordPress REST API, which is, it starts with wp-JSON. Actually, I've got to take that out. So when you do a REST API request, it starts with wp-JSON / then the rest of the path to your REST endpoint. Now, REST endpoints aren't always needed. So it depends on the plugins and applications and how you're using your WordPress website. But most SME websites do not need the REST API. So blocking it here to Australian IP addresses, in my case, means that I don't have to worry about people targeting those REST APIs as well. Now, you can disable them at a PHP level again, just using a filter. But again, someone does a REST request, it's got to fire up index.php, it's got to fire up the REST call, it may even do a database connection, uses up resources to determine that, hey, we actually don't allow this to happen. So I think blocking it at this point is actually better. So what you would do is, this is a complete list of Australia in this case. You could even be tighter on this if you really want to lock it down. You might only put in the IP range for your office, your home, your staff's home, internet connections. That would block it to only using their IP addresses. Say, for example, if it's a mobile network, you might say allow from 1.2.3.4/24. That means it'll actually make it a 1. So that'll allow everything from 1.2.3.1 through to 1.2.3.254. So you can, when you're using a mobile network, often the IP address changes, but if you know the ranges that they use, you just take the first 3 octets, put a 1 for the 4th octet into a /24, and then it opens up that mobile network. So instead of putting everything in there, you can just put those ranges in as needed. I tend to find that in my case, if I lock down everything to Australia, it incredibly reduces the number of attacks that I get on these files. So I'll only muck around with that if I actually need to. Big point here is that in Australia, I've got my website hosted here. If I ring someone or contact someone like Elementor or Cockablock for support and they ask for login details, I send them login details, they're going to get an access denied because they're accessing it from an IP address in Ukraine. I think Elementor is in Israel or wherever they're operating from. So they will get an access denied. So you either need to temporarily take this rule out, or you need to ask them for their IP address range and add their IP address range in here. Now, also, if you're using a scheduling tool for your posts, you can either not filter on xmlrpc, or even better still, get their IP range and stick it in here so you're only allowing that tool and your local IP addresses to access these files. It's just tightens everything up, minimizes the attacks, and keeps the resources nice and free. So that's from the htaccess level of blocking IP addresses that you don't want to access. I'm just going to go further down here in this file. There's a lot to go through there. We'll go down to how some caching works. So we use WP Rocket. Now, different caching plugins do things differently. I know, for example, with WP Supercache, you have an option to either use htaccess for your cache or use PHP. Always use htaccess because the PHP one, it has to fire up PHP, use PHP file methods to go and find the cache file and then return it. So it's still got to fire up PHP. So any attacks you have on your site, it is still going to put a load on your server because it's running PHP every time it gets an attack. Now, the other thing is the timing. So from my particular server in Sydney, if I get a file from cache, it'll be returned to me in roughly a small file, say an XML file, returned to me in roughly 30 milliseconds, 25, 30 milliseconds. If I allow PHP, say with something like Supercache, WP Supercache, if I allow PHP to do it, that at least double. So it'll be somewhere up around 50 to 70 milliseconds. So that PHP call is adding extra latency to that call. Now, this is the WP Rocket configuration. This is to do with just cache expiry. We're not going to worry about that. gzip compression, which I'm talking about very shortly. But just looking through all this, what we get down to is these important rules. Now, actually, what these rules are doing is they're looking at the cache directory for WP Rocket. It's looking for the URI, the host and the URI being requested, an index file. If your browser supports gzip, it will then add a gzip on the end of that. I can't remember exactly what it is. Let's have a look soon. If it doesn't support gzip, then it gets the index.html file. I'm going to show you the difference between that. So what this is doing, it's not firing up PHP. That's telling it, don't go to index.php and create the file or find the file. It's saying get it directly from the file system and then serve it back to the user. So PHP, MySQL, anything like that is not involved with getting these pages once they're cached. So that enormously speeds up how quickly it accesses them, and it takes an enormous load off your server. So you can have WordPress sites with hundreds of pages or thousands of pages, thousands of posts, tens of thousands, if not millions of users, and this will handle that extremely well because it's not a WordPress issue. If I access, for example, a WordPress homepage, and there's no caching and it takes 1 or 2 seconds to get that file back, that's because PHP, MySQL is firing up, it's getting all the plugins and theme stuff running, it's going to the database, pulling everything out of the database, constructing the file, and sending it back to you. So you're looking, depending on your plugins and your hosting performance, you might be looking 1 or 2 seconds before it actually returns that file. Once it's created the file, even if it's a slow server, so even you've got really useless, cheap hosting, it's a slow server, once it's created that file, it does not fire up PHP. It goes straight to the file system and returns that file. So then you get it back in a matter of, depending on your hosting, in my case, 25 milliseconds, 30 milliseconds, but sometimes it might be 50 milliseconds, 60 milliseconds, rather than 1 to 2 seconds. So that's what increases your performance here. So quickly just showing you the file manager. If I have a look in here, have a look at my content, look at the cache and WP Rocket. So it basically creates a folder with the URL. And under there, it's got a folder for every URL that's created. So in this case, I've got, say, for my cookie policy, I go in there and there's 2 files. There's the index HTTPS and then there's the gzip version of it. Okay, and look at the difference. So I'm going to go back one. I'm going to look at my home page. So my home page is 195 kilobytes. Okay. This gzip version of the exact same page is 27 kilobytes. So your htaccess file goes, does your browser support gzip? If yes, then return this file, this 27K file. If it doesn't support gzip, then return this 195K file. Now I'd be surprised if there's any browsers that don't support gzip these days. So case in point here, one thing that people tell you often to do with Elementor is to set the preferences for CSS to create external files. Right. Now, the thinking around that is because the more CSS you've got internally embedded in the HTML, the larger the file is. So every file has to load that same CSS. Instead of getting a file of CSS which gets cached, and on the next page you don't need to load that cached CSS. Now that can also create what they call FOUC, or flash of unstyled content. Okay, so let's say it gets the HTML, it starts rendering it, and there might be even a 0.1 second delay of getting the CSS file you see a flicker. You'll see maybe the menu might flicker, or some of your fonts or some of your layout might flicker, and then it comes right. So you get a bit of a flicker. If that CSS is embedded in the HTML, you do not get any flicker caused by that CSS because it's already part of that file. Now, in my view, if the gzip file is only 27K with the CSS embedded, why do I care? I would rather do that and have that CSS embedded in the HTML so that it looks good. I don't get any flashing of stuff as it comes up. And it's a tiny little file that's got to transfer anyway. So I don't care that every page has to load that CSS because it's so compressed that it doesn't add anything to your performance. It doesn't degrade your performance in any way, in my view. So that's pretty much what I'm using. So WP Rocket, making sure that WP Rocket does this by default anyway, is that it gets the files directly prior to PHP by using htaccess redirects. I then create a deny and allow list using this website over here, and that forms my basic locking. If I was going to open this up internationally, I would probably take out the wp-JSON out of there. I can't see a need for taking out xmlrpc or wp-login because only me and my people are going to be logging in. And if I want someone from overseas to log in, I can add their range in here if I need to. wp-JSON, if I had a site that had some front-end components that use wp-JSON to communicate back to my site, then I'll probably have to take that out of there as well. And maybe just make it a little bit more secured using nonces and things like that, but it's still going to have to run PHP. So that's my view on how to do this and keep it as fast as possible. Use good caching that does htaccess redirects, lock down these files to only the IP addresses that you need, and you should have good success with your server performance, regardless of whether it's a top-end server or sort of a mid-range server. Hopefully that explains a few things. It's just my point of view, but hopefully that explains why we need to do this. And